Brilliant. Okay. Well, welcome to this afternoon, everybody. We're going to make a start. People are still trickling in, but hopefully will catch up with us. We're recording the session so that people can listen to it again, or people who couldn't attend can listen to it at another time. We had over 600 people registering for the webinar, so we're expecting people trickling in. Somebody can't. So if you have no sound, the majority of people, I believe, can hear us. So if you have no sound, try and check your audio settings. Perhaps we can't do anything from our ends, I don't think. So let's make a start. We've got nearly 250 people, and that's a good point at which to start. So this is also obviously a presentation about adults at risk of exploitation. And what happened is, over 2 years ago now, Kerry tried to get some funding to support some research to evaluate what they were doing in terms of adults at risk of exploitation in Newcastle. And together we prepared a proposal for the NIHR Applied Research Collaboration Northeast North Cumbria. And they funded part of her time, which enabled her to be backfilled to work 2 days a week, was it? With me on this project. So we'll talk you through what we've done, a little bit of the context for Newcastle, and then what we've done in terms of methodology, and then the finding. There will be time for questions at the end, although depending on the number of people attending, we might ask you to pop questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer as much as we can. And what I should have done is introduce myself. So I am Monique Lucier. I am a prof in public health and wellbeing at Northumbria University. So this has been funded by the ARC Northeast North Cumbria, conducted by Newcastle City Council.
You're on speaker again, I'm on mute. Is that okay? Can you hear? Right, okay.
Can everyone just put their microphones on mute for us, if that's okay? Thank you.
And conducted by Newcastle City Council, Kerry, and co-led with me. So Kerry, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Monique. So my name's Kerry Cook. I'm a Safeguarding Adults Manager for Newcastle City Council within Newcastle Adult Social Care. I am the single point of contact for anything to do with adult exploitation in Newcastle. So very much work I do on a day-to-day basis, and been doing this for roughly around 10 years now. So it was brilliant to get the opportunity to get some funding to kind of do research and really look about how we work in Newcastle, what works well, where there are areas for improvement, and how do we share our learning nationally. We know that this is an issue that needs a lot more raising of awareness and trying to get people on board, that this is very much something that we do need to address across all our agencies, really, and how we look at supporting and safeguarding those adults who are also at risk of exploitation. So obviously I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about how we work in Newcastle so you understand that, and what I mean by exploitation, and talking you through the research, the methods we use, and kind of what findings, and how we can kind of look at how do we embed those findings across practice. So what do I mean by exploitation? When I'm talking about exploitation, these are the types of exploitation that we're seeing. So we're talking about criminal exploitation, seeing different forms of that, whether it's forced shoplifting, forced begging, we're seeing illegal dog breeding, we're seeing all different forms of criminal exploitation occurring. And within that, obviously, county lines is something that we see, where people are made to move drugs around. And that's not necessarily just moving them to other parts across the country. It can be within our region and locality as well. Sexual exploitation, still very much see that this happens to adults as well as children. Home takeovers, people might know that as cocooing. We're trying to change our terminology around that at the moment, because we think home takeovers is a better way of kind of explaining that the lack of choice and how trapped somebody can be in that situation, where somebody's home can be taken over. People often think that that's just related to county lines, and while it can be related to county lines, we see multiple different types of home takeover occurring as well. Modern slavery, obviously included within that, and often people think exploitation just is modern slavery, but what we found, and other people might find, there's lots of different types of exploitation that don't fit within the modern slavery legislation. So I've touched on sort of forced drug dealing, whether that's county lines or whether it's in the area, or what maybe there's no kind of actual run-in or mobile phone being used, but other types of forced drug dealing. We see lots of financial exploitation occurring, as well as debt bondage, fraudulent use of benefits, fraudulent use of bank accounts, and also handling and storage of stolen goods. Obviously, there's different types of exploitation as well when we think about mate crime, where people are exploited and groomed to be their friends, radicalisation. There's all those other different types of abuse where exploitation can be occurring. But these are the type of things that we're seeing and having to address within Newcastle. So if we just touch on a little bit of the data, so the anti-slavery data, when we look at globally, we know that there are a lot of people that are trapped in slavery worldwide, and it's estimated 50 million. And there's a quarter of all victims within modern slavery that are children. We know that forced marriage is often an issue, and 22 million people it is believed were in forced marriages, and 2 out of 5 of those were children, and that migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to forced labour. So if we look at kind of data and what we've got around the scale of exploitation within the UK, and we look at kind of our data through the Home Office and national referral mechanisms, and again, those national referral mechanisms are only where people are thinking that somebody's a victim of modern slavery and trafficking. We know there's a huge number of people being exploited, that data is not being captured anywhere. But in 2022, over 16,000 adult victims were referred into the NRM as potential victims of modern slavery, highest number since it actually began. And UK nationals have their second highest number of referrals, with labour exploitation still being commonly seen as the most common type of exploitation within modern slavery. And actually, it's evident that there are very few referrals submitted by local authorities. Obviously, local authorities are first responders as well, but it's clear that local authorities are not always referring in, say, as often as the police are. So it's very much, it is an issue out there, and actually very much underreported is what I would say. So if we have a quick look at kind of what the literature is saying, what is out there at the moment, because us in Newcastle have had to kind of learn along our way over the last 10 years, because there hasn't been a huge amount of literature or research, and there still is a lot lacking really around research and guidance around adults at risk of exploitation who have got care and support needs. So that's kind of where we'll come on to and explore. So it's very clear there is literature out there now. I think a lot of people recognise that modern slavery legislation doesn't cover what it needs to. There's a lot that falls outside of that legislation. And there is a lack of support often for British nationals. So if we're trying to refer British nationals through the NRM, often that's diverted back to the local authorities to look at housing and support for them, and it doesn't always meet their needs. We know that there's various different types of exploitation that you think that would sit within that, especially home takeovers and cocooing, and that's not included in there either. So I know there's a lot of push to try and change some of that as well. It's very clear, I think, that the Care Act is not being consistently applied nationally across the country. We know that there are multiple SARs. Often the same key themes are coming up, that safeguarding process is not being used, Care Act legislation not interpreted correctly, lack of professional curiosity, lack of understanding of control and coercion, lack of legal literacy understanding, and that exploitation is often a feature in those SARs. So it is really an issue that we need to address and understand. We know that perpetrators target vulnerabilities. I think it's clear that, you know, that there's lots of different papers and research out there, and especially with there's a huge focus on children, and rightly there should be, but there is adults are invisible really a lot of the time, and a lot of that comes down to the adults being seen as making choices or complicit in the abuse that they're experiencing. But we know that it's not unusual really when perpetrators seem to be able to identify someone's vulnerabilities a lot better than agencies and services can. A lot of time people's vulnerabilities are missed or undiagnosed, or they've been misdiagnosed. So often people are not really identifying and understanding that vulnerabilities that adults had. So there's a lot of a push around transitions now and contextual safeguarding for children up to the age of 25. Again, that's needed, those better transition processes, and really looking at contextual safeguarding. But what happens after 25? So we know exploitation and abuse doesn't just stop because someone turns 18. It doesn't just stop when someone turns 25 either, and it can happen at all ages. And that's certainly what we're seeing in Newcastle. So it's really trying to push and push for understanding that exploitation happens to all age adults. Okay. So why Newcastle? I suppose I just wanted to not necessarily sell ourselves here. Are we perfect? Have we got it completely right? Have we got it, all sorted? No, we haven't. It changes. Exploitation changes all the time. Perpetrators and organised crime groups are ahead of the game all of the time. So we've constantly got to adapt and change. But we do have 10 years experience doing this now. We use our safeguarding adults procedures, which is considered quite rare nationally when I've spoke to our partners and networks across the country, and the various different research pieces that have been done. We use our safeguarding processes operationally, and we use them at a strategic level. We have a subcommittee that's joint children and adults, where we look at missing, slavery, exploitation and trafficking. We have dedicated exploitation roles in safeguarding. So there's myself as a safeguarding adults manager, and I have a dedicated adult social worker that does exploitation work within our adult MASH. We do have a separate MASH. We don't have a joint MASH with children's, and we have a separate dedicated safeguarding adults unit, in addition to our community teams who oversee complex safeguarding cases and organisational concerns. We have a really wide interpretation of the adult at risk criteria. We think that's the right way to go. We think too often adults fall outside of this legislation and this criteria. So we have learned that over the years, and I'll go on next to explain why we work the way we do for those that don't know. We have partnership work, and we have excellent partnerships really in Newcastle, and I'm really thankful to say we've got brilliant networks and relationships with our partners that helps us do the work that we do within the local authority in adult social care. We have regional exploitation meetings, which are police run, and we meet weekly, and that's with children and adults representations from social care across our 6 local authority areas. That allows us to look at all exploitation markers on the police system, cross-reference what we've got between children and adults in our region. No surprise that people often cut across different regions and areas, so it really helps share information, stop people falling through the gaps, and really check what processes are in place to support and safeguard that person. And we've got a strong recognition of transitions. We've been doing this for a little while now, and really trying to ensure that transition processes are as robust and effective as they can be, and having good partnerships between children and adult social care. That's a must. You've got to be working closely together, and it's not about putting all the responsibility on one organisation or one partner or one team. It's how we all work together and all take actions forward and share that load and responsibility. We have won awards, which I'm proud to say. And we did actually win the Gold Award for Adult Social Work Team of the Year in 2017. We were the first team nationally to be looking and recognising that adult exploitation happens, and looking and having something in place to try and support those adults. So why are we set up, and why do we work like that? So in 2013, over Christmas, it was a 21-year-old lady with a learning disability who was starting to speak to her social worker and share experiences around the abuse that she was suffering at that time. And it was very clear that there was something on a much larger scale here. So some of you will have heard of Operation Sanctuary, which was a huge police-led investigation into sexual exploitation into a number of young women and young adults within the West End of Newcastle. And it was clear that a bespoke kind of approach was needed to that. So from an adult social care point of view, very much at the beginning, we were part of that. We were at the table, and we were very clear that we were going to use Care Act legislation and our safeguarding adults process in order to be part of that, coordinate the support, coordinate information sharing. Now, at the time, obviously, as that police investigation progressed, there was some additional funds from the Home Office. The police put in an application, and we were given some money for 2 years. And so there was a all-age, multi-agency exploitation team set up to support those women who were come forward and giving disclosures and going through that whole court process. Those really brave women. And this is where my passion comes from. I've been doing it for 10 years. I still bang the drum. It can still be a really hard, challenging area of work. But the bravery and of those women coming forward and did what they did really opened my eyes to kind of what can go on and how difficult it is for people who are experiencing exploitation, and the response that they can get from agencies and professionals, and really wanted to be in part of challenge that and moving things forward. But some people sometimes think, well, Newcastle got loads of money to do this. We didn't. As I say, there was this funding for 2 years. There is no more money. We've had to embed our learning and our practice across our agencies and our workforces, and that's what we've continued to do. So there isn't any additional money, but Newcastle City Council and Adult Social Care, they give priority to this. So there is me who does, I have a specific role around exploitation, and we have one social worker, but it's sort of embedded across the whole of adult social care on an operational strategic perspective now, because we do see it as something that's really important that we continually learn and move forward. So that's why we work the way that we do and why we're set up the way that we do. So I've touched on that we use safeguarding adults processes, and I just wanted to really bring up and remind people what the Care Act says for an adult at risk. And I think it's really evident we were doing this, but what we've learned through Sanctuary, and we did have a joint serious case review that was children and adults joint. So anyone wants to read that, it's the Spicer Report 2018. And it was identified that, yeah, we were doing the right thing. And actually what we found from the women that we were supporting at that time is that a lot of those women did have care and support needs. They might not have been known to adult social care, or we might not have had a huge amount of records or information around them. But when we were working with our partners and everyone putting bits of information together, the pieces of the jigsaw, which is what I'll come on to discuss what we need to do on a multi-agency basis, is that we were realizing that actually they did have support needs. Often they'd been not recognized. We had a number of young women who were then diagnosed with a learning disability, for example, as an adult. So when we were looking at kind of, at this criteria and looking back on it, yes, people do fit this. The reason why people think they don't fit this criteria is because they're not looking. And often we need to dig beneath to really understand. But, the local authority should be looking at making inquiries where they think that they've got an adult in their area, obviously over the age of 18, regardless of whether they're ordinary resident in their area, where the abuse is occurring. That local authority should take that forward to coordinate that inquiry, whether they've got needs for care and support. Now, some other areas, I think, or some of the things that I hear is that people say, well, if we're not providing commission support, we're not involved with them, it's not our business. Our understanding, how we interpret the Care Act adult at risk criteria, is that it's different to that eligibility criteria for commission support. They're experiencing, or if we think they're at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect, that we think they might be unable to protect themselves. And when we're looking at that, we're very much thinking, okay, so why couldn't someone protect themselves? Are they immobile? Would they not be able to physically remove themselves for something? Is there control and coercion? Is there concerns about their decision-making abilities, their capacity to make decisions? Are they intoxicated day and night that they're clearly not going to be in an ability to protect themselves? Or are they fully dependent on that perpetrator? So, we're really thinking about all of those things. And in Newcastle, we look for those signs, we look for those indicators, because exploitation is not always clear. It's not always clear cut, and it's certainly not always there in front of you. And there's not always someone disclosing to you what's happening to them. Sometimes people don't even recognize it themselves because of the grooming processes or because of their vulnerabilities. So it's our job to be able to do that for them, especially if there's a concern that they might not recognize it themselves. So we, as a local authority, I think sometimes people think it's safeguarding, pass it over to the local authority. No, the local authority's responsibility is to coordinate that inquiry, but we need our partners to cooperate with us. And actually, safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. Everybody has a role in it. So, it's about bringing everybody together and using that safeguarding process, a legal statutory responsibility that we've got to bring people together to share information and formulate joint risk management plans and all take responsibility. And the objectives of an inquiry, the Care Act is clear, is around trying to identify what somebody's needs for care and support are, because we don't always know them, and working together to how to reduce those risks, how do we support recovery, and about making sure that that adult or that person is involved in the safeguarding process as much as possible. And I have just put a link on there for making decisions on the duty to undertake inquiries, what local authorities should be thinking about and considering. There is lots of different guidance that's been put out there by the Local Government Association, trying to make sure there is some consistency into how this legislation and criteria is applied. And we know that the local authority, there's a key push for well-being, the well-being principle. And I think, the Care Act clear as well. If a local authority doesn't think the Care Act criteria applies, they can be using the wellbeing principle as well. So, there is that legislation to back us to work and have a multi-agency framework in place. Lots of other areas sometimes are setting up different kinds of processes around this. Us in Newcastle, we've got a process we can use. Let's use the one we have instead of having other processes, because we very much think this is the right process and it's the one that works and it fits. So if we just go on now to talk to you a little bit about the research I've been doing. Monique, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, so in 20 minutes you got a little idea of Kerry's passion and depth of knowledge of this area. Obviously, it's not my area at all. I come from public health. So when she first came to see me, and I was thinking, well, how do we begin to tackle that complexity with some sort of research framework? So we had obviously complexity at the level of the people, complexity of needs, but then complexity of the systems that might help to meet these needs. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we went about that. So when I'm saying we, it's not me, it's all Kerry. This is all Kerry's work. But she conducted 60 interviews, which is a phenomenal amount of work in itself. 10 of them were either adults or family members with experience or knowledge of exploitation or safeguarding services. 10 participants were professional at a very senior sort of level, and 40 were at an operational level. And it was really, really important for us to get these level of seniority, a variety of experiences of the system. And the kind of organisations that were involved were local authorities from both children and adult social care, from housing, neighbourhood and protection team and public health, but also voluntary agencies, health, substance misuse services, mental health services, care providers, police, probation, social housing. So you can imagine the complexity of that recruitment process. Much of it happens through Kerry's network and through snowballing approaches, because obviously she has this key role in the system, really. For the adults at risks and the family members, in terms of the interviews, we use vignettes. So if you want made up but probable stories of people who'd been at risk of exploitation, and that was very purposeful from an ethics point of view. So they didn't have to disclose anything about their own experiences, but could tell us about, what might happen to Alan or what might happen to this fictional character and how they might feel. So that was a really useful interviewing tool to help people engage with the process and help us think about what was necessary, what worked well, what worked less well, without having feeling that they had to divulge their own quite sensitive experiences. And obviously, interviews with professionals and people at a more strategic level covered their understanding of adult exploitation. What sense did they make of it, and the legal tool as well at their disposal to counter it. So we developed initial theories in realist evaluation. We talk about theories, and it's essentially initial explanations of how we think this using adult safeguarding procedure might work. What might it do? What outcome might it lead to, and why? We developed these theories based on a lot of conversations between Kerry and myself, based on her experience and her expertise, and then the data helped us test and develop and change these theories. So what we came up in the end was a set of much more refined and tested theories that explain what might be happening. And in parallel, obviously, we also let the data speak to us. So if Kerry or if we hadn't thought about particular aspects, then we'll let that emerge through the data. We also looked at exploitation and safeguarding referrals from November 2020 to February 22. That was 2,457 exploitation referral reviews, and an in-depth review of 58 cases of close exploitation for safeguarding inquiry. So that was quite a phenomenal amount of data over 2 years for just 2 days a week, I must say. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. So realist evaluation, really, what I told you about developing theories. We started by developing 156 theories to give you an idea, and that really reflects the complexity of this system, the situation that we might encounter, both the types of exploitation, but also, like I say, the systems around them, how they're detected, how do we understand these stories. And so in a traditional evaluation, you might want to say, does this work? And we knew that this wouldn't apply because the system was far more complex. So realist evaluation enables us to scratch below the surface and go, within this particular context, does this intervention create a change, reduce a risk, and why and how? And that's very much what these theories are formulated around, and why we use them. So it's really to try and develop the ideas and assumptions to know how, why, and in what circumstances the interventions using adult safeguarding as a process might work or might help reduce the risk for a particular person. We actually started, Kerry, when we started, you had such a quantity of data, we're thinking, oh, where do we start? And we started with the outcome to start with when you of your case reviews, and looked at when did risk reduce and what happened for that person. So that was, we started by, when was whatever we did successful, and we worked backward to see, well, actually, what did we do? What helped us understand better the situation of that person and put some sort of intervention in place to safeguard them better. So we ended up with really rich kind of causal explanation of why this might work. And what it means is these results that we have that we're about to present to you are contextually rich, and they are important, but they are also translatable to other settings, which is really quite important for this audience. I'm guessing, because you'll recognize some of the issues that you encounter in your own practice or research. Very obviously, this isn't about the methodology, but I'm very happy to answer questions at any point subsequently or in the chat as we go along. Go on, Kerry.
Thanks, Monique. So obviously Monique touched on that, or I had a look at kind of over 2,000 safeguarding referrals that we'd had in, where there'd been Section 42 inquiries, and we have a system that we try and get social workers or whoever's doing that inquiry to be recording what type of abuse that's occurring, and we have subcategories of abuse to try, and so it helps us identify some themes. So I was able to kind of look at that data. So I just kind of want to show that really. So out of those 2,457 referrals that had come in that had exploitation, some sort of exploitation marker on them, that was in relation to 1,264 adults. So that shows that actually multiple different referrals were coming in around multiple different types of exploitation occurring for one person. So there was a lot more referrals to the number of people. And I will go on and break down some of this data a little bit more for you and just go over it briefly. But basically, the main key findings or the themes that we saw around some of the demographics around the referrals that come in was that women were most at risk of sexual exploitation. That doesn't mean that men aren't, but we seem to get more referrals around women being sexually exploited than males, and that males are most likely at risk of county lines and criminal exploitation, and that our most common primary support reasons that we see within adults who are exploited are physical health issues, mental health, learning disability. So if we just move that on, just to break it down a little bit more for you. And as I say, the slides will be sent out, but this clearly sort of demonstrates there that females are mostly at risk of sexual exploitation, and we've got males who are most at risk of county lines and criminal exploitation. From an exploitation and age point of view, I think that it's evident that county lines, obviously it's our younger age group, our 17 to 25-year-olds are most at risk of county lines. Doesn't mean it isn't happening to older age adults as well, but that's where we're seeing most of the concerns and themes. For our cocoon and home takeovers, we're seeing that that's mostly likely happening for those adults who are over the age of 36 all the way up to 64. We see that of all age ranges. And for sexual exploitation, we're mostly seeing that happen within the ages of 26 to 35. So it helps break down a little bit more. But as I say, it is still happening. And it's very clear all types of exploitation are happening to all people of all age, all genders, all ethnicities, and all support reasons. The support reason one's a little bit more difficult to see. And I think what's difficult here is sometimes support reasons are not always being recorded on people's records. So we've got a lot unknown, which again is not helpful for really understanding what someone's vulnerabilities are. But it's very clear mental health, physical support and learning disabilities are key primary support reasons that are coming up in all forms of exploitation. So it really does highlight that there are vulnerabilities there. and we're not always known about until we start doing an inquiry. And this is why I'm so passionate about the process we use, because of all the information that we start unpicking and unraveling, and that's where you truly understand what support needs somebody might have. But unfortunately, a lot of people are making judgments before we even get to that space to be able to look at the support that people need. In relation to ethnicity, again, you can see that darker red burgundy colour, that's white. So in relation to the numbers of referrals that we're getting in, there's a huge amount of white British who are experiencing different forms of exploitation. Unfortunately, again, we've got where the yellow is, there's still a lot of ethnicity not being recorded to fully understand that. No surprise in that obviously a lot are unknown for modern slavery referrals that get in, where we might get referrals in and not know what someone's ethnicity is, may not have had a huge amount of contact with them, and potentially they might have moved on through the NRM. So some of those inquiries, we might not always be able to get that data. But I think it is really evident there that very much that, again, this is affecting people of all ethnicities. So when I'm looked at kind of a bit more of a deep dive around some close safeguarding inquiries that had been opened, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that really we came across when I was looking at that. And I was really trying to look at, well, what happened when the risk remained? What happened when the risk reduced or the risk was removed? From the data that I looked at, roughly it's around 75% of cases and the outcomes of safeguarding when they're closed is risk is reduced. And again, it's open to interpretation as to whether when that inquiry is closed, that person's interpretation was, did the risk remain or reduce? So it can be a difficult one to answer sometimes, depending on how you see it. But what we found from looking in those records, very clear that people were having multiple different types of vulnerabilities at once. And this is really important. So, we were seeing that people were maybe a care leaver, they maybe had physical health issues, mental health issues, neurodiversity, learning needs, often substance misuse problems. They might have had no recourse to public funds. So we're looking at what kind of vulnerabilities people had, and often people had more than one, and they had multiple different types of vulnerability. So it indicates how complex it is when somebody's got so many different support needs going on at once. Multiple different types of abuse occurring. As I said, it was often not just one type of exploitation occurring. And don't forget, within exploitative situations, there are multiple different types of abuse occurring. So we were seeing sexual abuse, physical abuse, financial abuse, psychological abuse, and within multiple different types of exploitation. We were seeing domestic abuse being something. We were seeing, obviously, children removed from people's care. Again, trauma upon trauma upon trauma, as well as offending behaviours. There was often that overlap again, which makes this a really difficult area of work, where there are both victim and perpetrator or offender, which again can make it really, really difficult for services or professionals to know how to intervene, how to act, or some of the attitudes that people hold. It was evident that escalation was needed in a number of those cases. It's certainly something I see in practice. Often need people to think outside the box, raise things up within agencies where sometimes we need people to think a little bit differently around what we can do. Legislation was something that was used, whether that be Care Act. So there was, out of those 58 cases, 12 of those had a commission support package put in place as a result of that inquiry. 4 individuals were detained under the Mental Health Act. There were 12 cases where the Mental Capacity Act was used, where we'd had to go to either court protection or use dolls and specialist accommodation. And there were 6 new cases that had got new diagnosis of learning disability and autism, where previously probably wouldn't have come to anybody's attention or really fully understood what that person's vulnerability. So it really highlighted, when we started looking at all this data, how complex it was and how everything interacts with each other, which makes it really hard. Looked at whether, obviously making safeguarding personal is really important. Sorry, Monique, were you going to jump in there?
I was just going to jump in to just say how it really highlighted, certainly for me, but the contrast between data collection systems that are quite simplistic in the end, that consider single type of abuse, for example, or single types of vulnerabilities, but actually the complexity of people's lives within that. And so how difficult it must be for professionals to record really accurately somebody's history, and how some of this is highly subjective. Somebody asked about how do you know that the risk is reduced, and it is highly subjective. So we could only work with the data we had, but it comes with an acknowledgement that it is what it is, and it's complex.
And it was something we explored within interviews. How do we know when risk reduced? And obviously there was professionals from a range of different agencies, and all had a different view on that. And all I would say to that very much is, it's so person-centered and bespoke per person. What is risk reduction for one person is completely different to another. And people spoke about, sometimes risk reduced if we can just make sure that that person's able to attend an appointment. Some people saw risk reduction as actually we've got them moved, there's no more contact with perpetrators. People had completely different views on when something that was risk reduced. And to be honest with you, so did the adults at risk and families. And I think that's why we can't say there's a blanket approach to this. Everything we do has got to be bespoke and person-centered, because what works for one doesn't work for the other. Yes, there's some things generally we can do and look at around disruption and risk reduction, but it's got to be individual. And that leads on making safeguarding personal. And that's why, again, I'm so passionate about safeguarding adults procedures. We make sure that that person is at the heart of it. Now, again, I know consent can come into this. If a person doesn't consent as an adult, obviously then we do nothing. No, that's very much not the case. And the Care Act's clear again. If we've got concerns about someone's decision making or there's control and coercion, then we should be looking at whether we're overriding that consent and progressing that inquiry. And I'll come on to kind of the adults' views about that, about overriding consent and how they feel about things being done to them, if you like. But it's still very much, even if that adult's not involved in that process, looking at advocacy, looking at family members who can represent their views, or actually do they want to just represent their views through someone else who's supporting them? You can always make sure their views and what their wishes are being heard in the safeguarding process. It's at the centre of it. And hopefully if we'll get somebody on board with that risk plan, you're more likely to get that risk reduced. But actually what these records showed was that we could still reduce risk even when that person wasn't wanting to engage in the process or fully engaged in the process. So it really highlighted to me, yes, it's really important, but there are various reasons why someone won't be able to engage in the process or doesn't want to or doesn't see the value in it. Again, does that mean we all walk away? No, it doesn't. There's things we can still do to reduce the risk for that person. So I think that's really, really important. And just to highlight quickly there, out of all of those cases that I looked in, 17 referrals were made via the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, but only 2 were accepted for accommodation. So it just shows you some of the difficulties we've got using some of those processes. So going on to kind of the interviews that took place, and it very much is about putting the pieces of the jigsaw together. So in a nutshell, what kind of the interview showed was, from all of the professionals I spoke to at a policymaker level, the adults at risk and the family members and the professionals, the operational professionals, everybody thought the safeguarding adults process was the right process to use. And whilst that process in itself doesn't just reduce the risk, it's a process to encourage us and allow us to all work together. But what we found was that the safeguarding adults process is only going to be really successful at reducing risk if all these resources work together at the same time for each of those levels in the system. So I'm going to go on to kind of explain that. But our 4 key themes that we came across was that people need to have the right knowledge and skills. They need to have the right attitudes, values and beliefs at all levels of the system, that we need relationships across all levels of those systems, and that systems are a huge issue. There are many barriers, but there are things that we can do. So we need all of that to be working together. And when we get that working well through the safeguarding process, when we can get that all working well, that's when we're more likely to achieve risk reduction for that person. So what did people tell us? What did they say? So if we break that down a little bit more, and I am trying to keep an eye on the time as well. So from the adults at risk point of view, when we were looking at the themes we had and knowledge and skills, what they were saying to us was, we need professionals to have knowledge of resources and processes. Like, too often professionals don't understand other people's processes, even so much as being given incorrect information about what the safeguarding process is. When we're relying on other professionals talking to them about that, they're often given wrong advice. So when professionals don't have the right knowledge around that, about what's possible for them, or to know who to speak to find that out, that's not helpful for them. They were really keen that they want professionals and, you know, those at a strategic level to really understand what exploitation is, the control and the coercion, the trauma, the fear. The fear is real, and the risk of retaliation to them and repercussions to not just them but their family if they're to make disclosures. They were really passionate about making sure that agencies need to understand this, and the lack of choices that they have. They wanted professionals, or whoever's supporting them, to be able to help them understand, educate them. They recognise that they don't always know what is happening, or recognise what's happening, or see what's in front of them, be given whatever's current situation they've got experiencing in their life. So they need people to help them understand that, whether that is the role of someone with lived experience. They actually spoke about those perpetrators that have been involved in that are no longer involved, that what role they could have in trying to get people to see what other people can do to them. They want professionals to understand the legislation that they're meant to work within. Even they were clear that often there's lots of people working within agencies that don't understand their own legislation, their duties and responsibilities, from the police to mental health to social care, probate, across all agencies. That was something that they were clear about, and they really wanted professionals to know how to disrupt or reduce risk to them when it was happening to them, but they weren't engaged in the process or didn't see what was happening to them. They were clear they wanted agencies to override their consent. They were clear that if this is happening for someone, there are often vulnerabilities and support needs there. They were very clear that perpetrators are targeting these vulnerabilities, and there are issues there that agencies need to be involved in. And they'll say, yeah, people will be annoyed at first, but that's our role, to then help them understand why we're worried about them, or why we're doing whatever we are to kind of reduce the risk to them. They were really clear about that. They want us to look beneath. They want us to look beneath presenting behaviours that they acknowledge themselves sometimes can be really challenging. They want us to be able to look and identify what vulnerabilities are, when their decision-making abilities might be impacted because of these vulnerabilities, whether it's a cognitive impairment or disturbance of mind or brain, or whether it's because of control and coercion or fear. They want us to understand that and look beneath. They want us to have the skills to do that. People talk about professional curiosity, but how much do people really go that extra mile to dig a bit deeper to find out what's going on? They talked about wanting professionals to have risk analysis skills, to really look at what information they've got in front of them, to be really good at assessing risks, because too often they feel that they're let down and professionals are not correctly assessing risk levels for them. And they spoke about family support a lot. They need professionals to really understand the impact on family and what expectations we put on family. So they were really keen that that's something we need to consider and involve in family. And they know, again, that consent, being an adult, is often an issue, but we need to start thinking about that, because they spoke about there are being valid reasons why they don't want their family involved, but often it's for the wrong reasons. So they put to us that we need to think about how can we manage that? How do we deal with that? With trying to listen to families, possibly without sharing too much information with families, but allowing families to share information with us. Professionals, again, no surprise. They want everybody to have exploitation awareness. They said there's nothing more frustrating when there's a new professional comes involved, or they're trying to refer to a service where they don't understand exploitation. You then get that barrier up, and you've got a complete massive barrier in the way to getting them the support that they need, because people aren't trained and don't understand it, and it causes huge issues for trying to get the right support for that person. They spoke about there needing to be mandatory training. People tend to attend training when they're interested in this because they care. What about all the people who don't attend training? They're the people we need to reach and get. People spoke about whether managers should have, that training, or, going back to qualifications and courses at university. Are we doing enough to make sure people are aware of this and how it impacts? There was a lot spoken about, really, there's loads around there pushing about contextual safeguarding for children, but what about adults? Like, we really need to start pushing this and understanding, having the knowledge how to apply this for adult safeguarding. Really having an understanding of what disruption tactics people can employ. There are loads of different options that we can use out there. People just don't know it. So we need to make sure that people working within their own organisations understand what's a possibility. Because very much it's not going to work if people are coming to safeguarding meetings or involved in that and they have no idea what they can offer. So we need people to come and know what they can offer within their own organisation. So we need to do something to make sure that people are aware of that. And again, that's why you need specialist workers. People were really keen that having specialist workers around exploitation dotted in organisations is what's needed, not to de-skill the whole workforce, because they need that, but you need someone with specialist knowledge in it. It's so complex. There's so many dynamics at play. There are so many different things around disruption you need to consider through so many different legislation pieces, that we need to make sure that there are people with expert knowledge, not just for that knowledge around what you can do, but the knowledge of themes, associates, networks, and knowing who to escalate to. The Mental Capacity Act was highlighted as a huge issue that we still need to raise awareness and knowledge. And there's an over-reliance on social care to do MCA assessments when actually it's decision makers. So it's not being utilised properly again with all professionals in all agencies. No surprise there. And there's often disagreements when it comes to exploitation and really hard to assess. So what is it that, is it an unwise decision? Is it protecting the perpetrator? Is it because of grooming, control and coercion? Often having contact with a person is really difficult, or they're intoxicated, often intoxicated because it's used as part of the exploitation, or sometimes because people are self-medicated. So all of those things make it really difficult when exploitation's occurring to know if someone's capacitated or not. So it's something that we need to look at and start addressing in the area of exploitation. From a policymaker point of view, they were really clear that we need to understand the demographics within our local area. And the challenges we've got. We need to know how to target our resources. Everybody is on their knees. We know that in all agencies with austerity, but we need better ways of getting the data to record the different types, the scales, what's happening, because local authorities and all agencies have a duty to make community safer. Exploitation doesn't affect one individual. It's clear it affects families, it affects neighbours, it affects communities. It's massive. Okay, so when, it doesn't just affect one agency, and if that's what I can get across today, no agency can do this alone. It's not one agency's responsibility. We need a way to work together on this on a multidisciplinary process, because we all have different things that we can bring to the table and offer. So, they want staff to act as drivers and influencers. I'm very fortunate. My directors, my boss, passionate about this as well. They let us do the work. You need that, because they need to, they need that influence from operationally to feed strategically, to help them look at what we need to do and where their priorities lie. They were really clear that we need to make sure that their staff are trained, that there's clear inductions, that this is something that we're raising awareness of straight away, and making sure that the staff within workforces are fully aware of all of this. So they need to think about policies that they need in place around that, and also around staff retention and staff wellbeing. What's evident when you're doing this work, because of the complexity of it, the high risks that are involved, not easy to fix or solve, and often we can't fix and cure and solve it. It's all risk management. It has a massive impact on staff wellbeing. So the need to make sure from a policymaker and organisations that there are clear things in place to support staff. If we have staff on leaving or going on sick leave, that impacts on the workforce. And if we haven't got staff to do this work, well, that doesn't help the people at all. So it's really clear you need that in place from a policymaker. And those frameworks need to be in place. You need those drivers, those passionate people. But if they leave, what happens? So they need to learn from that and have the right policies and procedures and frameworks in place that is then fed down operationally throughout the workforces. They were really clear that we need to continue learning from SARS, so those safeguarding adults reviews nationally. Where's exploitation a theme? What are we doing? How does it fit what we're doing? What do we need to change from, learn from that? We don't put this on a shelf and it goes dusty. We continually look at what we need to do to improve and get better. Everybody saw the Safeguarding Adults Board as being a key driver and influencer in this area of work. Again, they can't do it alone. Community safety, criminal justice, youth justice, children's partnerships all need to be part of that. But very, very clear that actually the Safeguarding Adults Board, they have the knowledge, they have the skills, and that they're a key group that can actually drive this forward and push things. And that we still need to do a lot of work around how we raise awareness in the community. There's lots that goes on. We do that. And how do we learn from co-production, really involving people who've got knowledge of this in our policies and procedures.
And just to respond to a couple of comments in the chat, that people are saying it's not just about whether people care, and we completely agree with this. And some of this comes into this attitudes, values, and beliefs. The context, as as you rightly say, participant, the context means that professionals are pushed not to care sometimes, or are not given the time to care appropriately and have that curiosity. But that's come through the data in the next section. So just not to give people the impression that we were saying people don't care, but actually the environment within which people work doesn't always help them to care, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are some very passionate workers out there. There are, and a lot of people do care. There are some, I think, and it goes on to the next slide now, where attitudes, values and beliefs is a massive part. And if we haven't got the attitudes and values and beliefs right, are we even starting to try and look at the knowledge and skills that you need, or the systems that you need? So you need people to have, and we know there's a huge amount of stigma. If you think about what adults who are experiencing exploitation, you know, they might have mental health problems, learning needs, substance misuse problems, as well as obviously potentially being wrongly believed to be making choices or complicit in the exploitation or abuse, or an offender, if you like. You know, that stigma really is out there. Professionals do have that. We know there's lots of research on it at the moment. There is a huge amount of victim blaming when it comes to adult exploitation, and that's what the barrier is. So there are plenty of staff who care. They get frustrated by others who don't care, I suppose, is what they were telling me. It's certainly something we see in practice. So when you come across somebody with a victim blaming attitude, what that means is people don't risk assess correctly. It's a barrier to getting them the right support. And sometimes it's for self-preservation. I think sometimes, giving yourself is really difficult. Is it easier to retreat into professional boundaries? And because sometimes it's seen as too hard. Some people said it's like having 1,600 tabs open in your head and not knowing where to start. So is it easier just to kind of toss that blame or not look at it and not dig a bit deeper? Potentially it is, and that's what people were telling me. Some people are seeing that. So from an adult at risk and family point of view, they feel blame. They're telling us people make them feel rubbish. They make them feel stupid. This is language they were using, not me. But they want people to have hope that they can recover. They want people to have compassion and understanding. They said they just want professionals to have a bit banter with them and a bit humour. Have a two-way conversation. They sometimes feel talked down to. So we've really got to think about how we are communicating and approaching and trying to engage with adults being exploitation, because it's hard. It's not easy for them to engage with services, but services sometimes put the responsibility on them to engage with us when they're in an impossible situation. They want us to be able to help them improve their own self-worth. There is dismissive attitudes out there, unfortunately, and a high tolerance of risk. That increases feelings of shame, they were telling us. It reinforces messages from the perpetrators. So it is an issue we do need to recognise. They feel patronised, and if they feel like that, they're not going to trust you, and trust is the major thing for being able to get into that relationship with them. I am aware of time, so I'm probably going to skip, just do the key points, really, and obviously you will get the slides. From a professional's point of view, you can see it was really important, attitudes, values and beliefs. There was lots of different themes come out here. Professionals feel really accountable. They can feel blamed when they can't move something forward. They feel like they're holding a lot of risk. It's a lot of accountability for them. What if something goes wrong? What if I've done something wrong? What if I didn't do this, didn't do that, despite really trying? Language was a massive thing, that was brought up. There's still some of the language that's being used by professionals is not helpful. So in Newcastle, we've devised a language guidance document around adult exploitation and other complex adult safeguarding. It would be useful to use, trying to encourage people to think about the language we use. When language is recorded, certain languages used in recordings, that could impact on the next person who picks it up, and the next person who picks it up, and the next person that picks it up. So therefore, that nobody's looking beneath and understanding. They're already making those judgments off the victim blaming language that's been put in somebody's records for a long time. So there's often a lot of challenge that's needed. People need to be resilient and self-aware. This isn't easy work. You get knocked back, you get up again. There's a lot of arranging stuff, things not going forward, start back at beginning again. It is really quite draining and exhausting work, people said. So you need that support, not only of your managers, but of obviously your other professionals around you. Again, why you need a multi-agency team working on this. You need to be tenacious and passionate, and professionals loved being with other professionals working on a case where the same passion was clearly there, where people wanted the same goals. So from a policymaker point of view, they were very clear. They had a responsibility to create the right culture. It's got to come from those at the top. It's got to come from senior leaders. It's got to come from political buy-in, and how important political viewpoints can be around this work. And they spoke about being creative as an organisation and being brave. It's not about completely going against the rules and guidelines, but we need to bend them. It's about computer says yes. How do we say computer says yes instead of computer says no? It's the right thing to do, and we want to be able to do it. So how do we do it instead of just saying we're not doing it, or it's not our business, it's not our job? Relationships, again, so important. So from the adult at risk and family point of view, they want trust. They want trust. They want somebody they can speak to. They said they want someone to come on the journey with them, put an arm around them on the journey. They find these things hard. It's not easy for them. They recognize professionals are not friends. They know that, but they need someone that they feel that they can go to when things are not going well. So it's about being able to, keep going back, build those relationships, show you're there. Too often we're just closing cases, aren't we, straight away for non-engagement. But we need the time to make those relationships. They want us to be able to do that. They want to feel in safe hands. They're not going to disclose anything to us until they can trust us and feel like they're in safe hands. But they also said we need workers who can challenge us. It's no point just accepting some of our behaviours or how we are, but we need someone to do that in a respectful way. There's no point coming in straight away and telling us everything that we're not doing right and everything we need to do. The barrier is just going to go straight up. So, authentic relationships, and that's not hard to do, really, is it? You know what I mean? Speak to someone as a person instead of going out to sea as a task or a problem, is what they were saying. They've had a lot of bad experiences of professionals and workers. They need someone who's consistent. So we need to think about, how do we keep consistent relationships? We all change workers too often, don't we? They understand people go on the sick, on maternity leave, or whatever it might be, or leave jobs. But what transition process do we do if they just get a new worker like that? So, we need to think about these things as well.
I think the amount of honesty and insight that people had with you was quite amazing, isn't it? People who'd had experience with exploitation were really quite upfront, honest, and incredibly insightful through the interviews.
They really, really were. And then obviously professionals, relationships, no surprise here, having networks, go out of your way to make networks. You've got to make links. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours is the term a lot of people were saying. Get to know who your people are in other organisations. Get to know who you can contact. If you don't know something, they might know who to put you in contact with. It's all about making those networks. And it's not just about, get to know them, have a Teams chat, introduce yourself, say what you're doing, how you can help there. You learn to trust each other, learn from each other. People said that, yes, we need to challenge each other, and people are happy for that, and you learn that way, but you do it, it's best done in a respectful way and understanding each other's roles and responsibilities, instead of just getting annoyed with each other, telling you why all of you can't do something. Accept what you can't do, but then think about what you can do and work together on that. What possibilities are there? Keyboard warriors is what a lot of us are these days. How do we look at kind of trying to engage with that person and work together? Who's the best person to kind of do that engagement work? How do we provide that tailored support, and mix around people with the same passion, and try and share the passion you've got for this with other people by educating them instead of getting frustrated. And that's not easy to do. I get like that myself, but I continually try to educate people why this is so important. You need trust in other people as well, because you need people to share the load with. That's why you need relationships. You all need to do a bit. It can't sit on one person's shoulders. You all scaffold each other. So from a policymaker point of view, really clear that you need good relationships internally within your own organisation, but you need them at a senior level with your external partners as well. Being open to challenge. You need directors and senior leaders who are open to challenge and think differently. The Safeguarding Adults process was seen as a way, really, both operationally and strategically, to really help form relationships. So obviously that multi-agency bringing together of different partners, whether it be a Safeguarding Adults meeting or whether it's at the board, or whether some of our subcommittees that sit under the Safeguarding Board, that's the way to try and make sure that we've got those partner relationships and that everybody's on board with this as a priority, to then filter that amongst their own organisations. Stable and consistent relationships. Some organisations change their leaders a lot more often than others do, but you need that consistency. You need the right people in the right jobs, and it's how you do that and trying to understand that. And new leaders coming in, how you make sure they're aware of what the issues are to keep them on board with it. And having allies and a collective voice, you need that at a senior level to raise these issues up. It's no good if it just comes from one voice, but if you have allies across partners and across your regions, you can bring the issues and raise them up together, and you get that buy-in and that campaigning. So all of that's really important. So the systems, this is where things get really difficult. We all know these will come as no surprise to where the barriers are, the adults at risk, no systems are under pressure. They really do. They understand the pressure that professionals are under. They want professionals to get the right support that they need. They know that time's difficult. They know that there's no housing. They know that everything takes time. But they talk about, still having to repeat their story, which is really difficult. And there's still a lack of really access to drop-in services for adults around mental health, substance misuse day services, and the join up between all of the services. Or sometimes things too disjointed. So it's really difficult for them to have to try and be in 10 different places or 10 different professionals to see, how do we join that up? How do we look at psychological wraparound for them that's, not just 9 to 5? They were saying things don't happen between 9 to 5. Our lives don't work like that. So how do we start thinking about how we commission services and what our strategic delivery plans need to be? They need trauma-informed environments and accommodation. Accommodation is a massive issue. We know that's not always easy to get the right accommodations for them. They told us services remove support too quickly. Straight away, as soon as everything seems okay for a minute, it closes. But we've seen that there's a high chance of repeat safeguarding issues and concerns and abuse. So how do we not pull away too quickly? Because there's no point doing all that work, pull away dead quickly onto the next case, and that fall down and it's back in again and we're starting from scratch again. How do we think about that? This was something that spoke about a lot, and so did family members. And I was surprised by it in a way that they, really wanting to push for how we identify vulnerabilities sooner, whether it be trauma in childhood. So how do we get them the right trauma-informed response for that child, whatever they might have experienced throughout their childhood, whether it be play therapy, whatever it is, are we getting that right? I don't think we are, and how are we identifying needs? They're saying the siblings, so touching on whether their mum had drug and alcohol problems, where, it was a grandmother who was looking after her child, had been trying to take her grandchild to say, I think there's something going on here. I don't know if it's fetal alcohol syndrome, blah, blah, blah. And she said, she was pushed away by the GP and made her feel stupid, didn't go back again. Now, I think it's about, she was saying, why is nobody following up? Why does nobody follow up on this child that they know was born when the man was using substances? Why does nobody do any follow-up or checks? And this is from a preventative thing, they were keen that we need to get better at not just putting stickers on things. How do we prevent this happening? How do we identify if somebody's got a vulnerability as early as possible to get the right support in, to try and prevent them ever being a victim of exploitation in the first place and getting the right support? So there was a lot that they spoke about that. A lack of funding, obviously, for those over the age of 18. We have far less access to support for our adults than we do for children. So can we get it right? Before someone turns 18, getting assessments done, getting diagnosis done, because obviously once someone's 18, that becomes even more difficult to achieve. And no surprise, criminal justice system, no further outcomes. Even when they make a disclosure, they have no faith or trust in the criminal justice system. And there's a real risk of retribution. But what they did say is, but that's why you need other systems. Still do what you need to do to reduce risk to us, because using the criminal justice system is not always the right way for us. It's traumatic, it takes time. Unless any of that's going to change, we're not going to use that system. So we need to see what else we can do. And that was their viewpoint. From a professional's point of view, again, they said a lot of the same things that the adults at risk did. They feel real frustration in the gatekeeping and bottlenecks that there are at the moment. They talked about conflicting barriers that we've got when exploitation's occurring. So how can we get the evidence to move someone accommodation when they're not making any disclosures or don't recognise the exploitation's happening? How do we still push for the mental health and substance misuse issues when there's meant to be, obviously, there's dual diagnosis? We're still having those fights. It's mental health, it's substance misuse. How do we access rehab for those that need it the most, but they've got to show commitment to get there, but they're never going to be in a situation to get to that point. So there's lots of conflicting systems going on all the time that make it really difficult for professionals. And this is why you need your escalation processes, and the safeguarding process can help do that. Transition plans obviously was something that we need to get better and making sure we're understanding each other's legislations. And the Care Act's really clear about what we should do about transitions. So, you know, it is really clear when it sets out whose responsibility is what and what we should be doing. But again, different interpretations around the legislation. Professionals are so frustrated around the different interpretation of legislation that we can use within our powers. One person sees it one way, one person sees it another, and often they get confused when different professionals come involved and have a completely different view on the legislation you can use. Now that again, across all our partner agencies, don't necessarily know exactly how we solve that, but we need to try and make sure there's some consistency around how we apply in legislation, especially when exploitation is occurring. And again, prevention. Well, how are we going to get ahead of the perpetrators? We need to think about this more, and that comes from the policymakers as well, with something that they wanting to look at more. How can we pick up on where these issues are going to be? And, you know, they really did rate the Safeguarding Adults process. People respected it so much, like from that, how it benefited them as a professional to learn and make networks, but seeing the progress that can be made, it makes people accountable. It shares out the load, it shares out the risk. And people thought they were really helpful to keep reviewing actions and thinking a bit differently and thinking about what we're doing for the person, what we're doing around the location the abuse is happening, and who are the perpetrators? Are they vulnerable as well? Are they open to other services? Do we use parallel processes? So what are we doing to reduce risk in all of those areas, you know, and making those partners with all the other people who can do stuff, whether it's trading standards, licensing, neighbourhood teams, housing, police. So we all need to join up, and the way to do that and trying to get people on board with it all to cooperate us is through the safeguarding process. And from a policymaker point of view, obviously, no surprise, lack of funding makes it really difficult. But how can we be innovative? How can we be creative with what we've got? We can still look at what we can do. So it's about doing that. And even without funding, our policymakers we spoke to were clear that you just need the right governance and partnerships in place. And you can decide that you are going to do something about it, and you can. You know, that there's no guidance from central government really, but you know, you can feel like you're left making things up, or you're in a situation where other people won't take responsibility for stuff. But that's why you use all the partnerships and the boards that you've got, where people have to, and there's that expectation people will buy into stuff. You know, that there is a huge amount of depersonalization going on, where, you know, increased demands, you know, there's huge increased violence in our areas and things, and that, you know, sometimes people say, we haven't got the funding to do this, we haven't got that. But, you know, if we think about the right thing to do, not only for the person, obviously, but, you know, when exploitations occur, and as I say, it impacts a lot of people, it impacts a lot of agencies. So how do we start looking at sharing resources? Who are the people who are presenting in each of our agencies the most? Who are the people who are most at risk, most vulnerable? How do we get together then to share our resources? So thinking about how do we start doing that, because there's a huge financial cost to all agencies when adult exploitations occurring as well, because of all the support needs and the risks and all the dynamics that are going on. So it's about prevention and early intervention. How do we start looking at that? How do we commission our services, and what do we need to change? Obviously, CQC start coming in to expect adult social care. What are they going to be looking at? Can we make sure there's some scrutiny and auditing around what people are doing nationally to try and get a consistent response? But that we need to get better around data collection and sharing, using intelligence, you know, and again, those partnerships we've got and the different ways that we share intelligence in Newcastle through our safeguarding boards, through our safeguarding meetings, our MSET subcommittees, really important, because everybody's got a piece of that jigsaw. We all need to work together to share that. Then police can use that intelligence to see what they can do to target perpetrators or what's going on covertly without the person ever having to come forward and make disclosures. You know, there are organised crime groups out there. Sometimes we know who the perpetrators are, and it seems impossible when we're relying on disclosures, when people are so fearful. And to be honest, you know, you can understand why they don't. The risk of retaliation is real. So we need to think about all of those things. How do we get the systems? What work with what we've got? We're not always going to magically get extra money from central government to do that work. So how do we free up, and how do we do developmental work that'll help going forward, keep people safer, but hopefully be more time effective and cost effective for us going forward? So we kind of summarised. Monique, I'll let you kind of just describe the overarching programme theory we came to amongst all of that.
So you'll have seen the depth and the quantity of data that we've got here, and the sense that we've made of all of this. But and each of the themes or bands that Kerry had on each of her slides were actually a program theory about what might work in that space. So but we brought all of this together in one single diagram to make sense. And this will sound like common sense to most people, I think, who are listening, but most people, and you can't see my cursor, I'm looking at the system resource safeguarding adults process. So, you know, a lot of the practice and literature out there assumes that having a safeguarding adults process in place leads to the outcome, to risk reduction. And what we found is actually that causality link is often assumed, but it's not that's far too simplistic. And what our data highlights is that this safeguarding adult procedures are absolutely key, but what makes a difference in Newcastle is that it's embedded in a context where professional and decision makers have the right knowledge, skills and attitude, and you know, and that's really, really important. And that really leads to a response that is much more holistic, proactive, person-centered, and leads to that collaborative work that you were talking about. And that's really, really important, that sense of shared responsibility that people have, and the need for creativity, curiosity, and drawing from various legal frameworks. So that's really one, in a nutshell, what all of this data was trying to tell us. Now there is a framework. Can you change the slide, Kerry? I'm trying to go across the screen. That's it. A framework called the normalization process theory, and that's really a little bit helping us to think, okay, how can we embed this? So most systems across the country do use safeguarding adults procedure, but I think this theory can help us think about how do we implement it better? How do we enhance these contexts that we talked about? So coherence talks about how people make sense of safeguarding adult processes, how different it is from their prior work, what does it mean really in their day-to-day work. And it's really, our studies highlighted the crucial importance of all agencies and professionals involved sharing the same values around safeguarding adult processes and adults at risk, and sharing the values that people need to be treated fairly and protected from exploitation. So a shared understanding of the impact of trauma, control, coercion, and the concept of capacity is really key to that sense of coherence. People need to have the same understanding. And cognitive participation is about everyone at every level of that system understanding what their particular role is within that system. So because it involves so many agencies, you might have one mental health worker who doesn't on a day-to-day engage in that type of work, or doesn't understand their work as being embedded or relevant to exploitation, and yet it is. So each and every person across the system understanding their individual role is really, really key. People need to have lasting and trusting relationship that develop within, but also beyond their organizations, so that together between agencies, they can highlight exploitative relationships and decide together how to proceed. The collective action is about bringing all of that together, having operational practices and also strategic policies that need to make sure that collaborative work happens, and that's absolutely key for adult exploitation. And then obviously reflexive monitoring really relates to the fact that this is not a work that will ever be finished, that will ever be complete. There is always more work to be done, and learning to constantly happen. So it's about thinking as a system that evolves constantly and as a learning system and learns and engages in whatever in all the processes going forward.
So I suppose just to conclude, and I just want to say, like, I feel like it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because there are so many different parts to this, and I could probably talk about victim blaming attitudes for a whole day in itself, as well as the use of the Mental Capacity Act and the Care Act. So, you know, and this is what we found when we were unraveling all the data. We know there's so many different parts to this. So obviously we have written a paper. It's an overarching paper trying to bring this all together as a starter of kind of all the issues that there are and all the different dynamics at play in such a complex area of work. Obviously, I can't share that paper at the moment because obviously we're trying to get that published. But as soon as it is hopefully published, we will then be able to share that. And I think it evidences there are so many different areas of research that are needed. And, you know, I was having a quick look through the comments there, and I know, like, you know, yes, people do care, and it's compassion fatigue and it's caseloads and make that really difficult. But there are still those victim blaming attitudes out there that we really do need. If we can start challenging some of those, and it's just the language people use around, you know, making choices, places themselves at risk, you know, chaotic, doesn't engage, all those kind of things where it puts all that responsibility on the person. There are bits and pieces we can start to do to challenge and start conversations now, you know. And as I said, that I think what we found is that you know, the safeguarding adults process was certainly widely respected and valued in Newcastle, as I say, not just being helpful for the actual adult at risk, but for everybody involved in the process. Brings everybody together, and everybody felt that actually it was a shared load. They learnt lots, you know, and it really helped them in their job. It helped them, made their job easier, as what people were saying. And it puts the adults' views at the centre, whether they're involved or not. And it allows us to still work collectively together and share information in a legal way that people feel happy with, and still looking at what we can do to support that person. So it makes you feel like you're able to do something within your job, and it provides some hope. And, you know, the adults themselves felt it was a useful process for professionals to support and work together. So, you know, without that extra funding, there are things we can do. We know there's still gaps in legislation and policy, but there are things that we can still be doing now to try and manage risk and ensure a coordinated response, and start thinking about what do we do to make sure that communities and people are safer, and are we really making sure that we're doing everything that we should be doing within our own statutory responsibilities and duties within each organisation. Because adults experiencing exploitation face barriers. They do face stigma. They do have co-coordinate vulnerabilities. These are often missed. So we often have lots of vulnerable people being exploited that services are pushing away or saying they won't engage with us and being closed, and we're leaving someone potentially really vulnerable without the support that they need. We know that there are heavy workloads, you know, but we still need to make sure that people do understand the impact of coercion, and substance misuse goes hand in hand with exploitation. So we need to make sure we're understanding that. And then there's the victim blaming that comes with people who are using substances. So we just need to make sure that we're raising awareness of it. People understand what exploitation is, know how to look for it, and start thinking about how each of our organisations are set up and what do we need to do, what can we do within our power. It is possible without extra funding, and just being organisationally brave, innovative, and having the passion for it, and having drivers and influences. But we have a long way to go, and we'll constantly have to keep changing and adapting. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into kind of adult exploitation. Very much happens. It's really complex, and there is work to do on this, a huge amount of work to do, but hopefully it's given people some ideas of things to take away. And obviously we will share the slides once the paper's published. We can share that, and obviously we'll let people know where this recorded webinar is if people want to watch it. And just to finish off, to say thanks, as mine and Monique's email addresses if you want to get in touch with us. We have our Newcastle Safeguarding homepage, so on there you'll see our policies and procedures. There's a whole range of resources and guidance, from language documents, engagement principles, little bite-sized videos around engagement and exploitation awareness. There's all sorts on there, so it's worth having a look for any of those guidance that might help you in the meantime. So I know we're like literally got 10 minutes left now, but
I know. I think just to add to that, so I think from a research perspective, whilst we've got a huge amount of data and information there, we feel like we've only just started to scratch the surface of this, and there's so much more research that could be conducted. Somebody asked, and the other thing I want to say about the resources for practice, so the resources were developed as a result of Operation Sanctuary, but actually we will revisit then in light of our findings here, and continually continuously update them. To go back to some of the questions, somebody asked about the timescale for publication. So we have a paper currently under review. We're at the mercy of reviewers and journals for that, but we have a list of at least 5 papers that can be published from this research. And somebody else suggested, you can tell from the quantity of what we've just presented that we have a lot to say about this, and there are a lot of aspects of this research that could warrant a paper in and of its own right. So this will be our nice work for some time yet, really. Scrolling through the comment. And I can't, so apologies for people, for some reason my system doesn't allow me to like any comments, but I would have liked lots of it. Somebody's suggested that we ought to have follow-up sessions, and we can certainly think about that, can't we, Kerry? Either have sessions on particular aspects of the work, or sessions covering tools and techniques and resources for practice. We could organise that going forward. A lot of people relate to what you've been saying, and it means a lot for the area. There was a comment about the vicarious trauma. I think that's absolutely right, and how we develop the system to enable people to operate in a more safe way within their own practice. I can't keep up with. Yes, and so a few people have asked whether the slides will be shared. We will upload the slides and the recording on probably the ARP website or Northumbria University website, or actually probably both, and we'll notify people through the same communications channels we've used to disseminate this.
We can have a look through the chat as well and have a look at some of the questions or anything that you've put in, and we can make sure we try and get back in touch with people. Obviously, I know in case we're running out of time, can't we?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But anybody, I'm more than happy to be contacted. I know some people have said, are we happy to be contacted? Yeah, my email address there and Monique's is there. So please feel free to drop us an email if you do want to speak to us about anything else. Because as I say, I know there is a lot to take in, and I could have spoke in depth about so much more. It's just to try and give you an overview of kind of all of the issues that were coming up in all of the data collection and the interviews. So we will be looking at what our learning is in Newcastle now. There are things that we can learn, and it's thinking about kind of obviously, you know, how other people can think about this learning within their own organisation across obviously, you know, all of the area. How anybody wants to kind of use it and start thinking about it would just be brilliant to start making people think about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's the point of the research is to support practice and not just being for its own sake. A couple of comments that came through around perhaps the profile of exploitation per ethnic group. This was a very early comment, and then later on a comment around, have we seen changes over time with the cost of living crisis? But these are areas that we haven't delved into in any kind of depth. So when I say we've only just scratched the surface of it, these are the kind of areas that we could look into going forward, is more detail into the profile of people presenting or being referred, and whether that's changed over time. But yeah, not something we've looked at just yet within this piece of work. I don't know from experience, Kerry, whether you've noticed a change in the types of exploitation since the cost of living crisis.
Well, obviously with the cost of, I think, you know, the things we've seen, that poverty is something that is impacting people a lot more. You know, obviously there's lots of different bits we do in Newcastle as well, where we've got workers from adult social care, from safeguarding, going into our food banks and doing a lot of work around that and picking up safeguarding issues and exploitation. But it is something that I think is part and parcel of life now as well. You know, we know, and coming through COVID, you know, we saw changes in exploitation through COVID. You know, the perpetrators adapted, and we did see changes in kind of, you know, the home takeovers when people were going back out after COVID. But yeah, I think because people generally are really struggling now, and we know that some of our, you know, our young people, when they spoke to us, you know, there's a lot of pressure on families as well, and bringing money into the family. They've spoke about that. So I think, you know, the cost of living crisis does impact on that, you know, and that grooming and that control and coercion that can go on. You know, people think that again, it's not all about, we don't always see people with brand new trainers, new phones and all of that. We do see that sometimes, but very often we don't see that. We see a deterioration in someone. So it doesn't always mean, that people are actually gaining anything financially when they're being exploited. Some people do, other people don't. And we see self-neglect as a huge thing that's linked to exploitation. Self-neglect, and again, that's a category of abuse in itself under the Care Act, goes hand in hand. So when we see exploitation happen, we often see quite severe self-neglect as well. And if you link that in with, the cost of living crisis and poverty, it all just makes it layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. So it is something that, we will try and look at anything that needs addressing to make a situation better for someone.
Okay.
I don't know if there's any question anybody wants to speak or say, or whether obviously we can go through everything in the chat and make sure we've covered everything afterwards as well.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great ball of wool to try and unravel and make sense of. Yes, absolutely. That's certainly what it's felt like.
But thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. Really, really means a lot that so many people were interested in kind of hearing what we had to share today. So hopefully, it's been useful to you.
And we will keep in touch. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you.